USTRANSCOM is responsible for the global synchronization of air, land, and sea deployment and distribution for the Department of Defense. General Lyons was commissioned in 1983 after graduating from the Rochester Institute of Technology with a criminal justice degree. He has a Master of Arts in Logistics Management from the Naval Postgraduate School and a Master of Science in National Resource Strategy from the Industrial College of the Armed Forces. He has held various commands during his career, including command of the 82nd Sustainment Brigade, the 8th Theater Sustainment Command, and the United States Army Combined Arms Support Command at Fort Lee, Virginia. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor to introduce Lieutenant General Stephen Lyons.
Hey, thanks, appreciate it. Hey, please have a seat. Everybody doing all right today? Wow, I'm impressed because when I was at this level of course, I was on the very, very back row where if my head went back, I'd have a wall to support it. I appreciate it. You guys are wide-eyed and awake today. It's really a pleasure to be with you. I want to take probably about maybe 20 minutes just to kind of frame a discussion. I would really like to get into a Q&A with you. I really would appreciate the hard questions that you have. And then I've got a little bit of something at the end. Well, first and foremost, to the United States Air Force, happy birthday. Hua? That's what we say in the Army. I don't know what you guys say in the Air Force. Aim high. But, hey, this is not insignificant, though. I just got done with a session with the Joint Flag Officer and General Milley on VTC, and he was talking about, 69 years, although he used 70 because he considers the Air Force an extension of the Army's ribs. 69 years of air superiority. Now, if you don't think a ground guy appreciates air superiority, trust me, I really appreciate air superiority. I see a lot of mobility airlifters in here. If you're a mobility airlifter, could you raise your hand? There we go. And for the rest of the community, if you haven't been part of the Transportation TRANSCOM enterprise, I can guess that you've probably benefited from that enterprise and multiple deployments and all the things that was carried to the force to sustain it. For you captain promotables, if you're a captain promotable, could you raise your hand? Wow, that's great. Congratulations. This really is, I believe, a pivotal point, I think, in your career, wherever that happens to take you. I don't know that I saw it that way when I was sitting in your chair, but I think in retrospect, I really do see it that way. And I'm happy to be here with you today. I'm really excited when I see the crowds, when I think about the future, and I think about the great leadership that we have that will lead us into the future in an environment that I think will be considerably different than the one we face today. And so what I want to do is take a few minutes. I'll talk a little bit about TRANSCOM. I'll talk a little bit about what I think are the TRANSCOM challenges, and then we'll move into Q&A. So if I can have the first slide. So being an outsider to TRANSCOM for most of my career, this is kind of what I thought. This is what I think you expect of U.S. Transportation Command. You expect us to be able to deliver the immediate force tonight. We do that, I think, extraordinarily well. And the decisive force when needed. So think of heavy Army Brigade combat teams moving via sea lift. And it's probably easier to give you kind of a rundown of TRANSCOM in a video than it is for me to kind of walk through each of the components and what they do. We'll come to that a little bit later. So I'm going to start out with a video, if you could roll it, and this will give you a little bit of a perspective on U.S. TRANSCOM. Okay. Can I get a hooah? Barely. It's all right. I understand. These are the 6 UCP missions for USTRANSCOM. And I show this largely because it was an evolutionary process. So the command is about to be 30 years old next year. It was formed out of Goldwaters-Nichols in 1987. Interesting that you see the single manager for transportation. That role came in 1992. Because when the command was stood up, it was stood up as a wartime planning only command. And it really wasn't until 2005 that it had its own separate, distinct COCOM commander. Prior to that, some of you may remember, the AMC commander would leave his headquarters, change patches, and walk over to TRANSCOM headquarters and veto the decision, the request that he sent from his air component. I think the rest of these you get. Global patient movement, distribution process owner came later, mobility joint force provider, global synchronizer. You may or may not be aware of campaign plan 9033, which is the DoD campaign plan for global distribution, led by USTRANSCOM. And then the JEC, the Joint Enabling Capability, extraordinary capable organization that provides planners to help stand up a JTF, as well as public affairs experts and some pretty high-speed communicators that can get away on a very, very short notice. Next slide. So I intentionally left this slide rather blank. This is how I describe the AOR for the functional, although Joe McDougall doesn't let me call it functional. It's a global COCOM. It's one of 9 COCOMs, but it's global in nature. And I want you to think just for a minute, because I think during the Q&A this will be relevant. What does it really mean to have a joint deployment and distribution enterprise, or this concept of a global distribution network? This is a strategic advantage that the United States enjoys to be able to deliver forces to influence activity across the globe. There's really no other nation that has the capacity to do this. And it's a network of routes, think of your lines of communications, of modes, airlift, sea lift, of nodes, because you've got to have echeloning capability, depending on where you don't have sanctuary to generate combat power. Providers that are both organic in nature, think of 18th Air Force, think of Military Sea Lift Command, or think of the commercial industry, and I'll come back to the commercial industry. That's an important part of the capacity in your transportation command. All underscored by a very robust IT command and control network, as well as, frankly, dozens and dozens of IT systems, decision support systems at echelon. When we're at a state that we're at today, where I would say uncontested, at least today, marginally we're contested in some areas, I'll talk about that. This network tends towards efficiency. So if I don't face an enormous or a significant threat, it's less complex and it's significantly less expensive. When we have discussion about great power competition, and I'm sure you know if you're 30 to 45 days in, you've probably learned to, maybe you haven't, the draft of the National Military Strategy is about to be published, but if we talk about 4+1 in cricket and great power competition, we have to think very, very differently, and this becomes a very, very robust network, very, very complex network, and a fairly costly network if we're going to have discussions about distributed basing and dynamic basing and those kind of constructs. This is as you think your way through various exercises that will come to you, part of the context, the way you ought to think about it, is how robust does this network have to become? And particularly so if you're in contested domains. So this year, we're in the middle of it actually, the SecDef identified 7 areas, what he calls strategic portfolio review, focused portfolio review to assess current capability against emerging requirements in the future. One of which was strategic mobility in a contested environment. And as we work through that, what we're discovering is that what is an incredible, powerful strategic advantage today has the potential to become a vulnerability if we don't adapt faster than our adversaries adapt. Next slide. I think the video covered most of this. These are the 3 traditional components, plus the JEC, which is a MACOM. Think of port management. This is truly joint. It's the Army component, but it manages surface transportation for the Department of Defense, both domestic and overseas. Military Sea Lift Command, I would say about 80% of their workload is replenishment underway kinds of operations and specialty operations for Fleet Forces Command. About 20-25% is military sea lift in the traditional sense of what TRANSCOM taps into. And that's a combination, to be honest with you, of the MARAD, Maritime Administrator under DOT, which owns a ready reserve force fleet, and a portion of which is CHOP, 10 LMSRs to Military Sea Lift Commander and a reduced operating status, what we call ROS 5 days to be ready, 6-day units show up at the port and roll out. Air Mobility Command is both a Title 10 MACOM for the Air Force, as most of you know. It has responsibilities to man, train, and equip the Mobility Air Force, as well as the 18th Air Force, which is a numbered Air Force that operates mobility forces, both in terms of lift, aerial refuel, aerial medevac, et cetera. And I wanted to really talk a little bit about right here, because I think it's important, something that I really had no appreciation for as a junior officer coming up as a professional, about how big of a role that the commercial enterprise plays in the global distribution network. This is an inherently commercial proxy network that we operate on. And we have 2 emergency preparedness agreements. One is called VISA, Voluntary Intermodal Sea Lift Agreement for sea lift. And one is called CRAF, right? Civil Reserve Aviation Fleet. I would suggest to you that the CRAF piece of the aviation enterprise today, because of the market conditions, is pretty robust, pretty healthy, 23 subscribers. There's really about 5 big airlines that we'd look to, probably for the equivalent of about 300 or so aircraft in the surge, and a large portion of that passenger. On the sea lift side, both organically with some of the age-out issues that we face, and the mariners that come from commercial industry that sail these vessels, that's an issue that we're contending with today in terms of what does the future look like in a major declining market for U.S.-flagged commercial shipping industry that has a very difficult time competing with foreign flag industry out there, and is it in a market capacity where the capacity far exceeds demands in today's global requirements. But it takes the entire enterprise to include commercial industry, of which we work very closely with, to deliver the force to the fight and to sustain the force as required. And I suspect many of you have ridden on these kinds of airplanes over time. Next slide. And it's in all areas: sea lift, rail, domestic freight, seaports, airlift. We've got 23 strategic ports around the West Coast, East Coast, Gulf Coast that we can go to. And so when we do the end-to-end analysis on the global distribution and joint deployment enterprise to see where those potential vulnerabilities are, we're looking for where we lack a certain resiliency. And that really leads us to a little bit of a discussion here in a minute on cyber. Next slide. There are some special authorities that are unique to USTRANSCOM that you will not find in any of the other 8 COCOMs. One of which is a working capital fund environment. That's how we resource and recover the costs of operations. Joint Task Force port opening, the JEC, we can talk about later if you like. Some of these. This is really important to understand. So the acquisition, our TCAQ, both in terms of program management for PM transportation and in terms of contracting authorities to buy ComAug, commercial augmentation. A little bit of money to do RT&E, RDT&E, computer network service provider, and an analysis center that I would tell you is a real gem for the Department of Defense. The analysis center does all the mobility capabilities analysis. What I would tell you is for the last 20-some years, that mobility capability analysis has largely been steady in terms of the requirements inside the mobility enterprise to meet our highest end military strategy, whether today it's defeat, deny, or et cetera, in terms of capacity of organic fleet and commercial fleet. And next slide. I think I'm running out of slides here because I want to get to Q&A. This all really, as I framed, leads to Joe McDow's top 4 priorities, and I would just summarize them as this. This is all about warfighting readiness. When we looked end-to-end and are in the process of for the strategic portfolio review, we came away with really a couple takeaways. One was the recognition that resiliency does have a military utility. Another that I took away, frankly, is the power of posture, the strategic maneuver of capabilities and assets and forces so that you have you're in a position both temporally, psychologically, and physically in a position of advantage. And the third really was in terms of potential vulnerabilities across the enterprise where we thought that there was the most consequential vulnerability forced us to take a new look at cyber, not just about building a joint cyber center, but about assessing the end-to-end network to include .com, which has consequential impacts on our national defense apparatus. The boss spends a lot of time considering Evolve for Tomorrow, and that really, if you look at that spin wheel of how the command evolves, that's an evolutionary process. You might ask, what's next? And then really all about people, and it is all about people, developing adaptive, innovative folks that can lead in some pretty dynamic environments. So I think, if I recollect correctly, I think that was my last slide. I think, there you go. Because I wanted to use as few slides as I could just to open it up to Q&A, to be honest with you. And I'll close out with a couple thoughts that really don't have much to do with TRANSCOM, but I think they have everything to do with you as leaders. So, questions? Are you the mic guy or are you a guy with the question?